Israeli-Palestinian conflict has always lain at the heart of Middle Eastern tensions. Yet the way it evolved in the last couple of years reflects the deeper rivalries, shifting alliances and power struggles that define the region. At the present time, the Middle East stands at a crossroads. Its cities scarred, its people wary. Yet, its spirit is unbroken. From Gaza's shattered streets and huge humanitarian toll due to the Israeli genocide, to the fragile economies of Lebanon and Syria, the region faces a reckoning that extends beyond war. How to rebuild not just what was lost, but to build a stronger future than before. The recent conflict has caused unprecedented damage, with an estimated 70% of all structures in the Gaza Strip destroyed or severely damaged, including approximately 92% of all housing units. The collapse of economic activity has led to a near-total unemployment disaster in Gaza, where more than 4 out of 5 people are currently unemployed, creating a social instability-type bomb. After over a decade of conflict in Syria, the World Bank estimates post-war reconstruction costs to the conservative figure of $216 billion, which is nearly 10 times its projected 2024 GDP, illustrating an overwhelming economic challenge. Lebanon's financial sector accumulated more than $72 billion in US dollar losses since 2019, and its national currency has lost over 98% of its value, with an income poverty rate that has dramatically increased to around 74% of the population. The day after keeps looking like a distant dream, with permanent peace still questionable, while at the same time there are ongoing talks about reconstruction. The question deepens. Can reconstruction become more than recovery? Can it bring the day after closer? Can it be rebirth? This session explores how nations, investors, and communities can try to turn ruin into renewal and fragility into the foundation of a lasting peace.
Hello everyone, delighted to be here. Thank you very much ECS for having us, and really happy to be sharing or hosting a panel of distinguished researchers and thinkers. And I want to start by saying that the keynote just given now by Minister Nabil Fahmy are perhaps an excellent introduction and framework for the various issues we're about to discuss now. Because obviously, it is easy to get involved in the details on the ground, but it's equally important to be mindful of the broader framework of prospects for peace in the Middle East. If this was happening a few weeks ago, perhaps we would have all been, maybe, I don't want to say more optimistic, but there seemed at some point that there could be a breakthrough finally, even with a framework that Minister Fahmy described as a framework written with pencil. But even then, there looked like there could be a momentum to follow. Things are not looking so bright again. There is more violence again. There is more determination, it seems to me, on the Israeli side to really extract all possible price out of the current situation. There may have been a lesser pressure on the Israeli government to respond and to listen to international public opinion, perhaps because of that sense that there could be a solution. But the truth is that we are still going through a very bad time, as indicated not only by the number of casualties and fatalities in Gaza, but by the emboldened Israeli attitude towards the West Bank, Gaza, the Middle East, Lebanon, everywhere. So speaking about the day after, it continues to be an elusive idea, and one that is perhaps still more of a theoretical construct in the future rather than a reality that can be achieved soon. But we will discuss this with our distinguished panel. I've already heard our presenter give their brief titles, so because we have very little time, I suggest we get into the discussion again, and I have asked every one of them to forgive me, and I ask you for not following the order of speakers here, because we have an idea of how to manage this. And therefore, I will ask Dr. Tarik Yousef, Senior Fellow, the Middle East Council of Global Affairs, and a very dear friend for many, many years, to perhaps start by giving us an overview of the regional power play as we stand today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the organizers of the Cairo Forum for inviting me to be with you today. Thanks to my very dear friend, Ziad Bahaa for handing over the mic for me to speak. I suppose in the interest of connecting the previous panels to the subject of this specific panel, and starting with the keynote that Minister Fahmy had delivered, which I wish he had more time to elaborate on many of the ideas in, and to maybe unpack some of the specifics that he left us with. I want to pick up on two, at least, ideas that Minister Fahmy had shared. And I hope we agree on how I would like to define these for the sake of providing some continuity. Minister Fahmy used the term historic crossroads. He said, we in the Middle East are at an historic crossroads. And he used also the term, we have an historic opportunity. So he's diagnosing essentially the moment, and he's providing an outlook on, or providing the roadmap for where we might want to go. And I think the discussion about the region right now, Ziad, ought to focus on these two themes. I hope we can agree on what they mean. And I'll share with you my thoughts here. They're tentative, they reflect where we are at the moment. Where are we at an historic opportunity? I think we are at an historic opportunity because for the first time in maybe a generation, the new shared threat for all countries in the Middle East is the state of Israel. For a very long time, I think we operated on the assumption, or we were told and we were lectured on Iran being that common threat in the Gulf and perhaps elsewhere in the region, and a number of other actors. At this moment, it's hard to argue or find one Arab capital or Middle Eastern capital where Israel is not the shared threat. And yes, it is Gaza, and yes, it is the expansionist policies in the West Bank, but it's also the very aggressive military attacks by Israel on sovereignty of other nations. 6 nations have been attacked. And it's very revisionist posture towards borders and towards the remaking of the Middle East. I'm not revealing a secret here. In Washington, until very recently, people were speaking openly about Israel possibly remaking the Middle East where it will be the hegemon. I think this is the moment where this has become a matter of consensus across capitals. And I think this is where it is significant in more ways than maybe we realize. If Israel is the new shared threat, then we can understand why countries are beginning to do things differently as we speak from what we were used to just a few years ago. And I'll be specific here. We have countries across the region diversifying their defense partnerships in accelerated ways. The so-called US umbrella of security in the Gulf has been now put into sham. Questions about how the region will collectively address the emerging conflicts and threats have only accelerated and mushroomed. So diversification of partnerships, of defense procurement policies, of localizing defense policies, and looking for regional solutions is increasingly becoming the orientation of the current period as a result of this shared threat. I'll be specific. Who would have thought that Egypt and Turkey will be engaged in significant naval exercises as we just saw a month ago? Who would have expected Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and possibly followed by others, to sign a broad framework for security and protection? Who would have expected Turkey and Saudi Arabia to be engaged in a rapprochement that is developing not just in defense and mutual security, but also in defense of Syria and with the aim of protecting Syria's sovereignty? I can name a number of these initiatives underway that paint a picture about a region that is now looking at an opportunity to where it can engage in collective security, mutual confidence, and divide responsibilities, because the American protection, the reliability of the American partner, is no longer something that anyone will take for granted. And you have a new would-be hegemon that is threatening, destabilizing the region. I'll end after just perhaps Ziad putting this in historic context. I have observed for the last 15 years how the US has tried to enforce a regional order that stood on 3 pillars. That's the order that's collapsed now on account of what Israel is doing. That order rested on the Abraham Accords, normalization between the Arab countries and Israel, and it was pushed hard in many different platforms. Think of the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, think of the negative process, think of the Abraham Accords themselves. Arab-Israeli normalization. Second pillar of that order was isolate and contain Iran and make Iran the boogeyman that it was and had become for many years, for a fault of its own, I would respect. Third, the third pillar, and I'll end here, Ziad, was to exclude Turkey from any regional order. So isolate Iran, exclude Turkey, force Arab-Israeli normalization. I think that ambition, that dream, is no longer tenable on account of what I've just described earlier. And maybe this is where I would disagree with His Excellency Minister Fahmy. I think the historic opportunity that we now have for collective security, for collective action, for mutual defense, and also for economic cooperation, comes from viewing the interests of the Arab countries as being intertwined increasingly with the interests of Iran and the interests of Turkey. That is the opportunity. We can approach it with confidence, with an open mind, and we can seek to build a bigger Middle East where we Arabs feel protected and safe, but where our legitimate security and defense interests and concerns are being credibly looked after by the region for its own people and for its own sovereignty.
Thank you, Tarik, for putting forward a clear idea and a controversial one, but certainly we'll come back to it and it's worth reflecting upon. So to continue trying to form this broad framework, I will invite Mirette Mabrouk, Senior Fellow of the Middle Eastern Institute, to comment on this and perhaps take it towards more of the rest of the world dimension.
So thank you so much. I'll make this quick. We have been talking about the ceasefire, and usually I pronounce ceasefire in heavy inverted commas, because honestly, as far as I can see, the most that it has done has given Europe and the United States a chance to retreat from any efforts to censure Israel for what's happening. And you have to bear in mind that in September, the United Nations OHCR released a report that said that Israel was committing genocide. Apparently, it really doesn't matter. Now, Tarik's points were vital, but I'm a tiny bit more tentative about the possibility of Arab unity, not because I don't think it's imperative, because I do, but because I think that there is a significantly more complicated net of proxies and priorities involved. Now, unfortunately, Israel does not exist in a vacuum. None of us exist in the vacuum. And it must be said that much of the world has been complicit in what's happening, and that the United States has given Israel just enormous and unfettered support for what it's done. Now, I mean, again, for clarity, you want to bear in mind that just since December 18th, 2023, the US has used its veto to veto more than 45 resolutions concerning Israel and Palestine, mostly on the treatment of Israel and the status of Jerusalem. Now, that's the United States. On the other side, you have Europe, all right, and I'm including the United Kingdom in that. There is, understandably, a huge sensitive patch in Europe because of the treatment of Jews during World War II, but with the greatest of respect, you cannot offer up the Palestinians on the sacrificial altar of your penitence. You cannot excuse one genocide by being complicit in another. But again, that's what we have happening. Now, all of this is to say, for us to move, I mean, we're talking about reconstruction. Before we get to reconstruction, you have to have the political will, because nobody is going to pour money into reconstruction only to have it blown up again 2 years later. It just isn't going to happen, all right? Israel talks about normalization, but at the end of the day, it needs to decide whether it wants to be part of this region or whether it wants to continue on its track. And you might want to remember that Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich recently mentioned normalization with Saudi Arabia by saying, well, if they didn't want it, they could go back to riding their camels in the desert and we would go on with our economy and our development. It is not a comment you make about a country that you want to be a partner with, right? All of this leads to, I don't at the moment see the kind of unified global partnership that is going to result in a movement forward on this issue. I don't see the political will. Now, I hope I'm wrong, and there are other ways to get around it. I'll maybe leave that for round two, but at the moment, I think that political will is tentative in the extreme.
Very much. So you're not explicitly supporting what Tarik said, but you're not going in the opposite direction, because what you're actually describing is the lack of political will on the Israeli side, and therefore
on the Israeli side, on the Arab side, on the European side.
On all sides. Let's try to pick up the situation on the ground a little bit and then come back to that broader picture. Khaled, if you don't mind being the next, and I'd like you to take us through the idea of the day after. This was a term that we used a lot a year ago when it looked like something will end and then we will immediately kind of begin to do reconstruction. This is, again, a notion that has changed over time. I'm not sure if it's still valid or not. So I'd like you to take us through that angle first, and then we'll come back to another question later. Khaled, by the way, Ezzelarab is an associate professor of practice and director of the Middle Eastern Studies program at the American University. and a veteran journalist and one with tremendous experience on the ground covering many very difficult places.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ziad, for this very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. I think what you mentioned about how the term "the day after" came to be used quite often over the past couple of years is very indicative, and I will come back to this towards the end of my comment. But I just want to start by saying that I don't think we are at a day after, or if it is a day after, so it's a day after something quite particular, which is the large-scale war in Gaza. But whatever we call the current situation, I think it is a very unstable situation, and it is not a sustainable situation. And the reasons for this are that there is unfinished business in Lebanon and in Iran from an Israeli perspective. I think the lesson that the Israelis came out of after October the 7th was that the strategy of containment has failed. We must face our enemies, the threats, directly and destroy them. And they've went into these military confrontations with Hezbollah and with Iran, but they were not able to destroy them. They were degraded. Hezbollah and Iran were significantly degraded, but they are still relevant. And we have not yet seen on the Iranian part a significant change in policy. The Iranians are still adamant that they will proceed with their nuclear program. Now, it's quite possible that at the end of the day, they will accept a version of the nuclear deal from the Americans that they had not accepted before. It's possible. But it's also possible that they will not. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has changed its policy when it comes to confrontations, military confrontations with Israel. It is not responding to Israeli strikes, but because it is taking a defensive posture at the moment, focusing, which makes sense from its own perspective, focusing on the need to prevent its de-armament by the Lebanese army in one way or the other. So there is no significant policy change on the parts of Hezbollah or Iran yet, which means that from the Israeli point of view, the military victory over them has not translated into a political accomplishment that is clear at the moment. It's quite possible that in the next few months it would. It's also very possible that the next few months will see an intensification and a deterioration of the situation there, because both Iran and Hezbollah have no interest in maintaining the status quo. And so we can see a new conflagration of violence there. More complicated is the situation in Gaza. His Excellency Minister Fahmy explained the process that is supposed to take place should the 20-point plan of Trump be implemented. Unfortunately, one of the key points here is that there will be an international force that accepts, and here is the question mark, will it be accountable to Israel? So Israel says, I need these people to be arrested, and this force will go ahead and do that. What countries are willing to contribute to this? Will it be responsible to disarm Hamas? These are question marks. On the Israeli side, what seems to be taking hold more and more is another vision in which there is a new line. So we have the green line from 1948, we have the blue line in Lebanon. Now we have the yellow line in Gaza, where Israel seems to be more and more of the considering staying there for the foreseeable future and build a new Rafah funded by Emirati money, as some of the Israeli observers believe they could achieve, while the rest of Gaza is kept under control. Again, not a sustainable option. Hamas is still relevant, it's still armed, and there is no reason for it to accept this status quo. I'll just conclude my remarks by saying that the Israeli politicians know all this. They know that none of these scenarios are stable, and they are not a day after. But I believe the reason why no alternative day after vision is being presented by Israel and why it hasn't been presented throughout these last years, the last couple of years by Netanyahu, is that the only acceptable day after, from Israel's point of view, is a day after in which there are no more Palestinians in historic Palestine. It's depopulating Gaza, which was stopped because of Egyptian insistence that it will not accept this, and depopulating the West Bank. This is not something that will happen in the immediate future, but until the conditions permit this to happen from an Israeli point of view, the only option is to not formulate a vision for a day after, keep a mode of apartheid in place until eventually ethnic cleansing takes place either voluntarily or at some point in the future by force.
Thank you, Khaled. Let's follow up on this with Dr. Majd Naber, Director, General, Team Leader, and Senior Researcher, Sustainable Development at the WANA Institute in Jordan. So we're still on the idea, even if it's an elusive one and not, not concrete in any way, of that day after. But we talk a lot about what happened in Gaza in terms of numbers of casualties, and less in terms of what elements remain that could make this place one day economically sustainable, environmentally sustainable. How can that work with the huge degradation that has taken place in the Gaza Strip, as well as other regions in the same neighborhood? So what can you tell us about this aspect with a slightly longer term than the immediate political negotiations and military actions? What is there to know on the longer term?
Thank you very much for this question, and thank you, Dr. Abla, again for the kind invitation. Actually, I will try to give a new lens to this conversation based on the question that was raised by you. Starting this conversation, we start talking about Gaza, about Israel, about Turkey, Iran, etc. But we can't neglect at WANA region, West Asia and North Africa region, we also have different countries under conflict. We have Yemen, we have Sudan. And our region is very well known from the early beginning, not only by its conflict, social tension, and its war, but also for limited resources. We were one of the countries in the world with a very limited natural resources when it's come to water, when it's come to food, and also when it's come to energy. To give you some numbers, 15 out of 17 countries that are most water-stressed country in the world are located in the WANA region. 5 out of these 12 countries are located in the WANA region, in the Levant itself, in the Mabrouk region, where Israel conflict is taking place. And the Israel conflict taking place in Palestine doesn't only affect the people there, it affects the water quality, it affects the availability of the water, and also the accessibility of these limited resources. So the problem in our region when it's come to resources, not only the limitation, but in different war contexts, water has been utilized as a tool to push power. In order to control the power, you need to control the water resources. And we see that in different countries. For example, in Yemen, it happened, there is different incidents where water dams and treated water plants were pumped by different radicalized group, and after rehabilitation of these dams and treated plant, it was repumped again in order to gain power. And the same happened during the Syria conflict in the past a few months and also years before the regime come. So when you control the water, you are giving the power to the radicalized group, and accordingly you are controlling the food production. Food production, then agriculture failure. Agriculture failure, then price shocks for the food. When the price shocks, then there is accordingly social tension and social conflict in different areas. Our region, if I want to describe it, we do have 3 scenarios: business as usual, more fragmentation, and collaboration. When we're talking about business as usual, we are talking about fragmented region. We can't deny that. Either it's because of Israel or because of the countries themselves in our region. Then if we continue doing business as usual, we will end up having more fragmented region instead of having a region with complementarity. Then we do have the 3rd scenario, which is collaboration. And collaboration, it doesn't only limit it to resolving the war between Israel and Palestine, but it's also collaboration by all aspects in our region. We are not saying that all the countries are not doing good. Some countries is doing much better than the other country, but at the end of the day, we do not have sovereignty in our resources. And do not having this, then we do have a question mark when it comes to our security. And when I'm talking about security, it's not only about the armed security. It's a security in general, peace and security agenda. If I want to shift the lens a little bit about what's happening in Gaza, I believe the word that can describe the international dilemma is the twin realities. Different countries that in the past used to advocate for the human rights were the first who were armed and fueling the conflict in Gaza. And at the same time, they're having, in the other hand, the human rights agenda. Same for the climate change agenda. Different countries that supported and hosted Kyoto Agreement, Paris Agreement, and they were the first to sign. They were also the first in sending arms to Israel in order to do this war against Gaza. And to give you some number, if you allow me, so the carbon footprint in the first 15 months of the war against Gaza is more than what was produced in 100 individual countries. And rebuilding effort could generate, in addition to 3 million to 6 million of CO2 equivalent. And this figure is higher than annual assumption or emission of over 135 countries. So conflict, war has a cost, environmental cost, resources cost, livelihood, and most importantly, people. Can I continue? For the collaboration scenario, yeah. When we talk about the collaboration scenario, which is the scenario that this is our ultimate hope the day after. It's not only limited to rehabilitation and rebuilding. I believe it should be out more than the damaged cities and rebuilding it. It should be also focused on the infrastructure. It should be also focused on job opportunity, job creation, inclusive livelihood, education. And when we say education, I believe different countries in the region can support Gaza in that. There is different initiative in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Egypt that support students and youth with a scholarship to attend our schools in Jordan and Egypt and other where we can support them in this kind of collaboration. Health system also needs to be rehabilitated, accessibility of resources, and also the good governance approach. And when we say good governance approach, it means that we need collaboration, co-management between the government, the state, the local communities, end user people, and the private sector with different instruments. And all of these under the umbrella of accountability. Thank you.
Very much. So, to summarize the first round, not to summarize all of it, but actually to pick up from where you've just ended, Dr. Majd. So, any possible reconstruction effort in the future in a sustainable way will require, obviously, thinking at the resources, at the financing, and at the political framework. And that political framework, where Tarik has provided an idea of the regional framework, but I would like someone, and I haven't decided really who is best to do this, but that also requires a political framework on the Palestinian side. So it seems to me that one of the most critical questions in all of this is who is going to be legitimately negotiating on behalf of the Palestinians in the next few months, perhaps couple of years. Can anyone volunteer to help us on this? Please go ahead.
I can just one word in this. It needs to be people-centered approach. The person who will speak and negotiate in behalf of the Palestinian people, he should know exactly what are the needs of the people themselves and not to be from external parties. This is in a nutshell.
It's a correct idea, but I'm not sure how we get from where we are now to achieving this. Tarik, do you have any comment on this in particular?
I mean, Ziad, I don't think this is going to be the issue that holds back the realization of Palestinians' right for self-determination. I think the Palestinians have paid the price not just on the humanitarian side for wanting and exercising and asserting the right to self-determination. They've also paid the price politically on account of their fragmentation, divisions, and non-stop efforts by external powers to divide the Palestinians. That's precisely one of the manifestations of what I was trying to describe earlier in the context of, regional competition, external interference, and I think this is what Minister Fahmy was also alluding to very clearly. So if one can begin to imagine collective action within the region, and I was very specific and upfront about this, I think the Arab world can do a lot together, but I think the Arab world plus Turkey plus Iran become a much more formidable front. And ultimately, I imagine this will be good for the Palestinians in pushing in the direction of perhaps Palestinian unity, reimagining their own legitimacy, and leaving it to them. And so I don't think that's going to be the holdup. That's not going to be the obstacle. The obstacle is the overall context for this, the role of the region, the position of the external powers. And let's be frank. I mean, I've spoken about an historic opportunity. We still have death and destruction in Gaza. We have Israel engaged in an uncompromising approach towards Lebanon. We have Israel actually trying to divide Syria along ethnic and sectarian lines, something that goes against not just the wishes and the hopes of the Syrians and the Arab world, but against European policy and American stated official policy. So, and the war with Iran could very well relapse anytime. So we're not out of the danger zone. One is trying to paint a framework for thinking about how to address as many of these issues, as many of these problems. And all I wanted to do, Ziad, is point to this opportunity and the manifestations of it on the ground as we see, beginning with Turkey and Egypt, but also...
I want to just tell you something, and I'll let you comment at the end. But you see, the thesis with which you started sounds very encouraging, and it's tempting to go along. But it seems to me that you're starting from one important idea, which is that Israel has become the enemy of everybody, but you're inferring from it a conclusion that's a little bit far out and far too stretched, which is that therefore the Arab world and other major powers in the region will somewhat act in concert. It's not clear to me at all that one leads to the other. So think about that, and we'll come back to you at the end. What is your comment, closing comment on that thesis, please, Mirette?
So I think Tarik makes an extremely important point. Let's start with the attempt to split Syria, all right? You can also look at the attempt to split Sudan. At the moment, we just had a massacre in Al-Fashir, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were an attempt to split Darfur again. And if you split Darfur, then you have to take Kordofan as well. So what you're looking at is an intense fragmentation in the region It's one country after another. Now, if you're given to conspiracy theories, you can say, well, somebody wants a lot of smaller, more easily manageable countries, but in actual fact, smaller countries are not more easily manageable. They are significantly more difficult. But the problem is, again, you're talking about political will. And yes, while Israel is a matter of huge concern for some more than others, you also want to take a look at the political considerations, which is, at least for the Gulf is interested in tech and AI, which is not merely an interest, it is part of their DNA for their development. And tech and AI means the United States and Israel. And that is going to be taken into consideration, I believe, more than any immediate solution to Gaza, which means that you are going to have this fishbone in everyone's throat for quite a while.
We'll come back to, I see you nodding your head. No, not yet. You're at the end. Khaled, I don't want to conclude this without resorting to your other talent as a journalist, really. Part of what's happened in the last 2 years is a remarkable shift in, perhaps I will call it simply, world public opinion, but it's more among the youth, the progressive circles, against Israel and pro the Palestinian rights. So much that it seems to have become a factor in shaping politics, not only something that occupies news. It seems to have been a factor, at least in determining some of the European reactions in the last 6 months. Part of that tension, I believe, has gone with the idea that there is peace on the table. What's your take on this? Is it still there, that world support? Is it long-term? Is it faddish with, just watching news and then it will disappear? What can be done about it? Or perhaps nothing at all? What's your thinking about this? Not as a media phenomenon, but as I said, as something that has become a political factor.
So there are a couple of issues here. There is for lack of a better word, how public opinion, particularly in Europe and the United States, has been reacting, and there's how the media has been covering the war. And normally one expects both to move in tandem, more or less. I'm talking about legacy mainstream media. In this case, it hasn't. And for the first several months of the war, I think we would all agree that the coverage by legacy Western media was shameful of the war in Gaza for a variety of reasons that we can perhaps get into at some point. However, with the continuing solidarity campaigns with the Palestinians, which I think would have, new media, particularly TikTok, played a significant role in maintaining this wave of support. We've seen an improvement in some of the coverage in Western media, some more than others. So the BBC is still, where I worked before, it's still, it's very disappointing in its coverage. The Guardian, for example, is much better, et cetera, et cetera. It's fascinating how podcasts, for example, in the United States, the most popular American podcasts, which are not even from the usual suspects, not liberal, leftist podcasts. In many of them, the language that is used is very, very surprising. Pro-Palestinian, very anti-Israeli. And we've seen the recent public polls in the United States. For the first time ever, more people sympathize with the Palestinians than Israel. In the US, it's particularly significant because of the difference between Democratic Party voters and Republican Party voters. So Israel has historically been able to count on support from both parties. This also happened during Biden's time. There is a question mark as to whether the next Democratic leadership will be able to sustain this sort of position towards Israel. And of course, if there is a change in American policy towards Israel, that's a whole different ballgame. So I think it has been effective. It, of course, will not be as powerful as it was when the genocide was unfolding. Of course, people will lose interest, people will think about other things, but you always retain some of the momentum. And this momentum, if it is organized, worked upon, can develop in the long term into something bigger. I mean, the South Africa boycott campaign started with activists before it became a global political phenomenon.
Sorry, Dr. Ziad, but it's related to what was mentioned, related to the youth. To be honest, I want to provide you with one example in how youth can influence the change of agenda of different countries. When the war against Gaza started, we had different projects funded by the Germans, and the main beneficiary of them were youth. A lot of them dropped out of the project, and several projects were shut down because of their dropping out, and a project that was funded by Germany now is reshaping their objectives and reshaping their agenda toward the genocide in Gaza. And now they are reshaping how they put their input in that in order to regain the youth to be participated in their project. So the youth has a huge potential in influencing the agenda of different, not only in TikTok, but also in projects.
Tarik, you have the final word.
Sorry, Ziad, what would you like me to respond to? On the
Specifically to those two ideas.
Yes.
That your proposal that there is a moment of possible convergence of interests in the region is one that I, and I think Mirette to a certain extent, have challenged.
So maybe to bring in the Gulf into this discussion right now and into this thesis, I've lived in the Gulf for close to 12 years now. The Gulf countries have viewed themselves largely as being islands of stability. All the conflicts, all the wars, or the instability happens elsewhere in the region, in the Levant, in North Africa. But in the Gulf, it's peaceful, it's safe, and hence they can afford, and they did, go about pursuing their economic agendas. Very successfully, I would add, very ambitiously. And increasingly, we've seen the Gulf wanting to play a bigger role on the global stage when it comes to high tech and AI. That has changed in the last few months. The war came to the Gulf. The Gulf felt incredibly insecure during the 12-day confrontation between Israel and Iran. And the Gulf felt especially concerned when Qatar was struck by Israeli missiles. That was a moment of truth for the Gulf countries. That is when they realized that the Abraham Accords weren't necessarily an insurance, and that, in fact, they could, maybe not necessarily within their own locale, but increasingly around them, conflicts were encroaching on them. I sensed, and I did hear people in the Gulf for the first time speak about collective security as being now something that has to be tackled outside of the Abraham Accords without thinking about whether America is going to come for their help or not. That is the dynamic, Ziad, that I was trying to point to. Now, are we going to move and take this opportunity and develop it? Will we see leaders actually build on it? I don't know. But I'm seeing glimpses and examples that I've cited where sovereignty is big, defense cooperation is big, localization of defense has become important, autonomy and diversification of relationships, not just in the Gulf, but also other countries in the Middle East who are forging ahead with China and other countries and beginning to diversify away from the US. Building on this, Ziad, I actually think this has economic implications also. If the Gulf countries start viewing their security as being intimately tied to the security of others in the region, they're no longer islands of stability. They want to be islands of stability. Everybody else has to be an island of stability. Increasingly, their economic plans and priorities and investments will become tied to a regional project. That is the vision, at least I would like to offer, as being a more credible one, a more reasonable one. And maybe after waiting for a very long time for the Americans and the Europeans to save us, we should save ourselves and look at our closest neighbors with whom we share culture and religion and history and begin to think in collective terms. That is the central idea here.
It's a noble vision. I think it leaves us with some sense of hope in the future. But having said this, and before we completely conclude, there has been some interesting ideas put forward by the panel. Other than that possible conversion that we heard, the introduction or the elaboration on the sustainability factors in the future of the region, I think are extremely, extremely important. And it's not just the few numbers that we heard, but it's the approach. We think, as I said, too much about casualties and too much about land lost or gained, but there is fundamentally sustainability elements that have to be taken into account. We've also heard about the idea of the day after being elusive, has transformed over the last 2 years very significantly. We've heard about the importance of taking into account the changing public opinion elsewhere and how it impacts us. And of course, my question to Khaled about changing and evolving young support for the Palestinian rights over the last 2 years and how that can drive us forward. I believe there is some voting to be done. And so before Dr. Abla gets on with her technology, I would like to thank the panel very much. Thank you all for coming and sharing your views. Thank you all for listening and for being with us. And I hand it over to the voting. We love voting, you know. We love voting, and we don't do it very often. So thank you for giving us the vote. But the question is a little too short. Do you feel optimistic about the future of the Middle East? I don't know. This is a little compressing it into your call. Your call.
How are they getting Gen Z from the others? How are they classifying? Get a certain
That's it, Dr. Abla?
14 seconds to go. The score is actually quite interesting. The Gen Zs are more I'm more hopeful than I thought. 50%, maybe, but it's risky. Okay. No, too uncertain, 22%. 17%, yes, time for rebirth. 11%, still undecided. Interesting. The others are decided, huh? Only 3% are undecided. They know their way very well. Things are very clear. And too uncertain. It's interesting. This is an interesting difference between the Gen Zs and not Gen Zs. Okay? And of course, and I expect that all the females, I mean, just by ego, are probably voting with the Gen Zs. All right, thank you very much. Thank you. See you, Ziad. Let's have a picture.